Great. So I will now introduce our panelists. So today we have with us Emily Drabinski. Emily Drabinski is Associate Professor at the Queens College Graduate School of Library and Information Studies and ALA past president. She publishes and presents widely on topics related to knowledge organization, information literacy, and critical perspectives in librarianship. Drabinski edits Gender and Sexuality in Information Studies, a book series from Library Juice Press, Litwin Books, and she is a contributing writer at Truthout. We also have Emily J.M. Knox. Emily is an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an alumna of the University of Chicago Divinity School. Her most recent book, Foundations of Intellectual Freedom, won the 2023 Eli M. Oboler Prize for Best Published Work in the area of intellectual freedom. Knox's articles have been published in the Library Quarterly, Library and Information Science Research, and Open Information Science. Knox serves on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship and is the editor of the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. They will be in conversation with Torsten Reimer. Torsten Reimer is the University of Chicago's University Librarian and Dean of the University Library. Under his leadership, the library has adopted a mission that includes supporting free inquiry and expression by transforming the global knowledge environment to be open, accessible, and equitable. He has launched an initiative to take a stand against book bans through programming such as this panel discussion today, and the expansion of access to banned books in print and digital formats. Dean Reimer has a background in digital scholarship and research infrastructures. Before coming to Chicago in 2022, he served as head of content and research services at the British Library. He has an MA and PhD in history from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He holds a range of board and advisory group memberships and currently serves as chair of the Ivy Plus Libraries Confederation and the Open Repositories Conference. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, the University of Chicago Divinity School, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago, and the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Now I'll pass it off to Torsten to begin the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Christy. Thanks to all of you for joining us here today, and thanks to both Emily Knox and Emily Drabinski for joining us. As Christy said in her introduction, the University of Chicago Library and, in fact, the University of Chicago are very firmly committed to freedom of expression and freedom of inquiry. They are sort of our foundational values, and it's, I think, in response to us seeing these threatened that last year we launched the Banned Books Initiative. That's partly designed to give people access to books that are banned anywhere in the United States for whatever reason, and we partner with the Digital Public Library of America to do this. But we've also made a commitment when we launched this that we didn't just want to provide access to information, but that we also wanted to take part in and encourage a wider debate on book bans, on the future of information and libraries, and I would argue in some ways on the future of a democratic and free society. And so today's event forms part of this. And it seems like a good idea if we look at this topic to maybe sort of start with the basics and the definitions. Because people might, and I notice from discussion, sometimes understand very different things when they hear a book's been banned. So my first question, and that's one really for both panelists, is how do you define a book ban? And what distinguishes it from other forms of content restriction? For example, how does a book ban differ from censorship or from a challenge? Maybe Emily Drabinski, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, I can share the way we think about that at the American Library Association. I think Emily Knox is sort of the expert in this area, so I look forward to hearing what you have to share on this question. But for ALA, a book ban applies to a book that is actually removed from a library. So that's different from a book that is challenged, right? Someone comes and makes an argument that a book should be removed or reviewed or moved to a different, that is a challenge. But when the resolution of that challenge is to remove the book entirely from the library, that is what we think is a book ban. But Emily, can you flesh that out for us a bit?
Sure. So the way I think about book bans and book challenges is I use something called the 4 R's. So those are when books are redacted, restricted, relocated, and removed. So a book that is redacted means that someone has marked through just some pictures or words that they're upset about. You might have heard about the case of Mouse in Tennessee. That's what happened there. When a book is restricted, I call this putting it behind the desk. So you have to ask for permission to use the book, either, from a parent, they have to sign something, or you have to ask the actual librarian, can I read this book? And they will hand it to you. When a book is relocated, this really refers to the audience, the intended audience for a book. So someone will say, this is actually not a book for kids. It should be in the adult section, even though the author said, no, I wrote this book for kids. It should be in the kids section. So that's really the best way to think about relocation. It's about author intent. And then finally, removal is the outcome of a challenge usually. So someone will say, okay, we're going to remove this book from the collection. But what I always caution is that the request for removal can be quite different depending on where you're asking to remove it from. So removing something from a school library is not the same thing as removing it from the curriculum, which is not the same thing as removing it from a public library. These are all slightly nuanced requests that really lead to a different type of information and accessibility depending on that challenge request.
Thank you both. Can I maybe ask a follow-on question to this? Those of you who work in libraries will probably know that it's not uncommon that libraries update their collections, that they remove items. And I sometimes hear, well, books being removed from a library is a very normal thing. Does that also apply to book bans, or how are book bans different to a library as part of their normal process deciding certain books are just no longer required?
It's an interesting question. I think why we always have to think of the conversation around book banning as not just about wanting to remove certain perspectives and certain stories from libraries and limiting access in those ways, but also as coordinated attempts to undermine the authority and agency of library workers. We steward collections. That's at the basis of what all of us do in libraries, and the need to keep those collections up to date, timely, linked to the curriculum if we're in an academic or school library, connected to the interests of our publics and the publics that we serve. That is part of the ordinary work of doing business. So while we talk about intellectual freedom as a value and a commitment, I think we also have to talk about the commitment of library workers to those fundamental principles and the fundamental commitments that we make to produce collections that our communities can serve. And sometimes that means weeding a book that is, we remember from library school all the reasons we remove it. It's dirty, it's outdated, it's, a 1976 CIA report on a country that doesn't exist anymore. Like, weeding those books is not an act of censorship, I would say.
Yeah, I will just follow it by saying that collection development involves weeding. So the important thing is that libraries have criteria that are followed when you weed a book, and those are individual to each library. And often they're based on space. This is actually something that I think is really important, that in fact, libraries don't have unlimited space for every book that's ever been created. So you have to make sure that your collection is serving the needs of your patrons. And I'm actually at Peoria Public Library right now, and I can see that they have some space on each of their shelves. They're like calculations you have to do to make sure that you have a certain amount of space to put new books on the shelf. And this is a continual process that librarians do, but this is not done on an individual basis. This is done in service of the institution and the collections and the patrons that use that institution. So I think that's one way to think about it. It's not an individual librarian saying, I don't like this book, I'm taking it off the shelf, which is what I often hear people think about with weeding. Weeding is a very deliberative process to think about what is needed to serve the needs of our patrons.
Yeah, thank you very much for that clarification. Leading a very large library system that is about to run out of space, this is something that is very much on my mind. And you're right, it's something that we normally approach through sort of agreed methodologies and looking at, in our case, tens of thousands of volumes potentially, although that will obviously always depend on the scale of the library. Scale actually is sort of an interesting point that I think leads me to my next question, which is one, Emily Knox, for you in the first instance. Your book, Book Banning in 21st Century America, was published in 2015, so almost a decade now. What has changed with regards to book banning since then?
So first, I should say I'm working on a second edition of the book that should be out next year. But actually, the reasons that people give for banning books have not changed. They haven't changed in 1,000 years. They are related to the power of the book, and that people think truth should be in books and books should be true. And they make all these different arguments about what should be in the text, and that books are such an important item that the way we think about them and how they transmit knowledge across time and space makes them actually have outsized importance in our society. What has changed is really the political situation that we are in. So we are in a reactionary time in our country, and one thing that happens in these reactionary times is that people focus on their local institutions. And because a local institution is where you have a almost direct say over what happens in the public sphere. So what we have seen is that there's been an increase in the number of challenges to, and I wouldn't even say just collections, just the books, but actually the status of public institutions in a particular community. So this is really about, what does it mean to have a public school? What does it mean to have a public library that is tax supported in your community? These are things that we are really discussing. How do we understand our society to work right now? What do we want the future to look like? And the way that happens is that people talk about their local institutions by saying, I think my institution should work like this. So that's really what has changed since 2015. We've just gone through this hugely reactionary presidency, and we are moving through a new front of the culture war, and inevitably public institutions are going to be part of the culture wars.
Thank you. Emily Drabinski, is there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, I think that's really spot on, Emily, that it's attacks on the institutions and seeing that as the terrain of local political struggle. And I think what we're seeing in many locations, not all by any means, and we're going to talk a lot, I think, during the session about the impact of these book bans and attempts to restrict access to materials and the impact of that on library workers. And it's definitely a problem, but it's not the only way that public institutions are under attack right now. And so I think seeing it as part of a broader movement to dismantle public education, which definitely, that has a longer history. I think you're right that we move through those different public institutions. And so we have a lot to learn from public educators who have had sort of efforts to sort of impinge on their capacity to teach what they want in the classroom, a sense of the need to control those institutions, that it comes to the library next. And so that they have chosen us as the terrain. I'll be very interested, Emily, in any thoughts you have on whether we're moving out of this, if like the attention to those institutions is shifting. I think in some ways it is, but thinking about it as absolutely an attempt to dismantle those institutions is really important. And, I've spent my whole career in academic libraries and seeing the sort of relative lack of conversation about these issues in that space, in the sense that that maybe that individual titles aren't being challenged in the same way in academic libraries. But I think if we could see what's happening in school and public libraries and link that to, say, attempts to dismantle a liberal arts curriculum in public universities, that those are parts of the same story here, which is an attempt for only some of us to have control over what kinds of stories are shared in a sort of a broader sense.
You just mentioned universities. Maybe I can ask a quick follow-on question to that as well. Have you also seen a shift in terms of book bans regarding the types of libraries that are targeted? So I think I understand the United States has a long debate about banning books in school libraries, but has that now shifted? Do we see this expanding across libraries, or does it stay relatively focused on certain types of libraries?
The big difference in the ALA statistics in 2023 was an increased number of challenges happening in public libraries, that the documented challenges were primarily in school libraries, and in 2023 we saw a 60% increase in the number of challenges in public libraries. So that's moving from school to public. And in terms of academic libraries, I think the conversation is a little different. Different kinds of things are subject to censorship in academic settings. I have seen, talk to many librarians who are forced by, or feel forced by, or pushed into by adverse legislation to rename programs, not have the word diversity in your on your LibGuide, and those kinds of challenges, which are related, I think, and the extent to which we can connect those fights, I think, would be a benefit for everybody in the sector.
I just want to say about academic libraries that what I've been recommending is to make sure that your policies are current, because I suspect that legislators and others will come after some, especially public academic institutions. I watch Florida very carefully. One of the first people fired at New College was the librarian. I do not think that that is a coincidence. I think a lot of people aren't aware of what might be on the shelves to support educational curriculum at academic institutions. And then we have to think about academic institutions very broadly. I mean, we're talking about community colleges, we're talking about large R1 institutions, small R2 institutions. Each of these libraries needs to be aware that they could become a target at any time. I think that's just really the situation that we're in, that we don't, if one person decides that they are very upset about something that happens at the small liberal arts college down the road, they might target the library. And so the library needs to be prepared to be targeted. And so that's my main thing I've been telling academic libraries is to, have your ear to the ground about what's happening, especially in places like Texas and Florida, and then to be prepared for someone being upset about something in your collection.
Thank you. I think that leads quite nicely into my next question. So, and obviously, book bans affect patrons because they restrict the freedom to read. But as we've also now started touching upon, they also affect librarians, and in particular, public and school libraries. And so maybe Emily Drabinski, starting with you, can you tell us more about challenges that members of the ALA and libraries face? And if you also have any thoughts on how those in academic or other settings can support public and school libraries and library workers, it would be good to hear about those too.
Yeah, so I just rolled off my term as president of the American Library Association at the end of our annual conference in earlier this month, I guess on the 2nd. So I'm a month out. During my time as president and president-elect, over those 2 years, I visited librarians in 31 states, 7 different countries, had countless conversations, both one-on-one and in groups with librarians, talking about the issues that they're facing. The sort of organized attempts to ban and censor materials, it takes a toll on individual library workers. So you have people like me, right, who have become subjects to sort of flashpoints for organized social media attacks, newspaper, like far-right extremist newspaper kinds of or media attacks that are just very wearing on a personal level. Like, it's challenging every day to show up. And so we have a number of people who have become in their communities flashpoints for that kind of attention. And that is really scary and really dangerous, I think. And, it's not lost on me that those attacks happen to people who are, for example, the school librarian of the year in Louisiana, Kimber Glidden, who managed the library in Boundary County, Idaho, who was removed from her. She ended up having to resign because of violence in that community. People would show up in cars with guns and follow her and her staff home from work. And that library, 2 years before this all happened, or 2 or 3 years, was Library Journal's best small library in America, right? So the attacks on individuals and individual libraries that are high profile libraries, right? Like, it's happening in all kinds of places that are not high profile, but there's a real interest, I think, in intimidation and in making people feel afraid and under threat. So even in parts of the country and schools where they haven't had the kinds of spectacular book banning sort of stories that we've seen in the media, the fear that that could happen at any time, it's really heavy with people, right? And that's on top of the other things that library workers are facing. Challenges to their employment rights if they're coming from sort of outside of the country, like the attempts to restrict sort of who can work in a library. You've got the sort of what I think of as the debris of 40 years of disinvestment in public institutions that walk through your door every day, people who are unhoused and have no access to public resources, a diminished social safety net that produces hunger, drug use, despair, mental illness, all of those things. That's all part of the story here. So library workers, on top of all of those things that make working in a library really hard right now, in a public library, working in a school library where you've seen the decimation of those positions over the last 40 years. I was in West Virginia during this library tour we did in June and learned that there are no school librarians for the vast majority of public schools in West Virginia, that there's just been, the state legislature just decided not to fund that. And so, you're dealing with those other kinds of issues that are happening, while at the same time, you're always in constant fear that what is happening to Emily Drabinski right now might happen to me. And so I think that as much as the censorship numbers tell one part of a really intense and scary story, the people who are not buying books, are not putting books on shelves because they don't want that conflict to arrive at their door on top of everything else, right? I think there's a silent censorship thing that's happening that I don't know that we have articulated well enough or really fully put our arms around. In terms of how academics and those in other settings can support those library workers, being aware of those stories, I think, is important, and then reflecting on our own work and seeing where we have similar issues, that our fights maybe look different, that it's not about an individual title. But, I've worked in academic libraries for 23 years, and I can't be the only person who's never seen a technical services worker leave a job or retire and then been replaced. Right. So like that's part of this same story, right? That libraries are open to these kinds of attacks, including academic libraries, because of the other ways that we've been under assault over the last 40 years. And so thinking about that and making a connection, that it isn't a thing that's happening to poor old school library workers, those poor school librarians, but in fact, reductions in force in academic libraries are a part of the same project, just to think a little bit more about that, right? Like, all of this book banning stuff relies on a sense that librarians, professionally trained librarians, are making book selections. And I think in many of our libraries, that's not happening. We're working on approval plans that we don't have a whole lot of say in, that our electronic database vendors are making decisions about what collections we have access to. And it's so hard to stay on top of that when we're not fully staffed in a way that can help us understand the scope of the problem. So I think supporting by being aware and alert and doing all of the things that any person in your community should do to support libraries, getting a library card, going to programs, using the library, showing up at board meetings, showing up when there's an ask, all of those things are important. But then also looking inside, what is happening in our libraries that make us potential targets for the next wave? Because I think Emily is just exactly right, that this is like they're moving through institutions. So we've got, a political candidate right now making very public, very direct threats to higher education, and we're going to tear that apart if we're elected. And that's part of this project, right? So seeing our fights as conjoined, I think, is really important. But I'd be very interested in your thoughts on that question, Emily.
I completely agree. I think the main thing that if something happens in your community, however you're defining that community, please show up. I was in Metropolis, Illinois, which is home of the largest Superman statue in the world. It was great to go down there because the community showed up. I cannot say how important that was. Everything worked out at that particular board meeting, but to know that people are there to support the library and the work that the library does actually makes a huge difference. And who better than other librarians to show up? I also want to encourage, if you're a librarian, consider running for your library board, your public library board. You're a great advocate for your local public library and your school libraries. So I've just been encouraging people to really think we have to be more political as a whole within the profession and the field, right? And to think strategically about how can I make sure my voice is showing up for all these other people who are essentially doing the same work of providing access to information, right? How do I make sure that works in my community?
Yeah, thank you both. That was very interesting. Having now touched a bit more on the libraries and the support for libraries, I'd like to sort of bring us back to the patrons that we're supporting. Looking at the book bans, it's really interesting if you look at the titles that themes emerge, and roughly half of those titles that have been banned are titles that are representing the voices and lived experience of BIPOC individuals as well as LGBTQIA+. In what ways do issues of race, gender, and sexuality intersect with the efforts to ban books in libraries? And I'll open this up to you, either of you would like to take a first step at the question.
Okay, I'll go ahead and take this first. So I think one thing to know is that when we're talking about diverse books, we are talking about books that are often dealing with difficult knowledge. This is actually Carrie Robinson's formulation for thinking about certain types of knowledge. These are things that adults often have difficulty talking about with each other, much less with children. So when you are talking about what is it like to grow up as someone who is minoritized in some way in our society, kind of by definition, that is going to be a difficult subject to discuss. I was out in Colorado and I was talking and I said, you know, how do you explain to a 5-year-old what happened to the people who used to live here? Where are they? How do you do that? That's a very difficult conversation that we don't necessarily want to have with each other as adults, much less with a 5-year-old who said, I heard that there were these people who were living here. How did we get this land? How did our house end up being here and these other people aren't here anymore? How do you talk about the displacement and genocide that happened in the westward expansion of the US? That is really why a lot of these books get banned, because they are actually dealing with some of the most fundamental issues of being a person. How do you think about your gender, your sexuality? What does it mean to be a minoritized person in a society that often oppress people who are minoritized? Like, how do you talk about that? And then especially, how do you talk about that with children? So it's actually not surprising that these are the books that are being targeted at all. I think we should also realize that there are more and more of these books. One of my favorite books that gets targeted is Lola Goes to the Library, which is a children's picture book, but a little Black girl who goes to the library with her mom. But what you realize is that if that book had been published, say, 20 years earlier, it would have been about a little white girl who went to the library with her mother. There has actually been a shift to talk about different stories, more stories that reflect our actual world. And everybody is not comfortable with that. And that is why we see this increase and this targeting of particular stories that people want to tell, to make sure that people's own stories are reflected in our collections, and it's not just what your patrons look like necessarily, but also people who live on the other side of the world. This is part of the work of doing library work, of providing access to information.
Yeah, I think, when we think about the attacks on the books, they're like also attacks on the people, right? That you have in Florida both a ban on gender affirming healthcare for kids and bans on the books about those experiences. And I think, thinking of it as an attempt to eliminate certain kinds of people and certain kinds of stories, that's really what's at play here. And I think I grew up as a little lesbian kid in Boise, Idaho, and there wasn't a single book anywhere for me to read about myself. The legacy of censorship of queer stories is very long, right? Like we go hundreds of years without the stories of African Americans being sort of written from their own perspective being shared in the public. So thinking about that as a kind of organized censorship also that we've been really fighting hard and working hard to dismantle. And I had a conversation with Mike Corrado, who's the author of one of my favorite banned books, which is Flamer, a graphic novel about a boy coming to terms with his sexuality at a Boy Scout camp. And it's just a beautiful, gorgeous book. And I asked him, what do you hear from kids who read your book? And he said, what I really hear is from grown-ups, from adult gay men telling him, had I had this book when I was young, it would have changed my life, right? And so the books matter, but the people matter also.
So as it happens, I also have a favorite banned book. Last October, when we announced our initiative, the night before, I sat there and I went through a spreadsheet of about 1,500 titles, which at the time were the titles that we knew had been removed from at least one library. And there was a title that stood out for me, and I then bought the book. It's about a little black girl called Kyla, who with her dog King goes out to try and find a book that she's borrowed from the library and has lost, and wants to return it so she can order new books. And I saw the title, I ordered the book, and I still struggle with trying to understand. I mean, this book is part of a series, and it might not have been that this specific book was banned, but that most likely the whole series was banned by someone. But in the line of work that I'm believing in the thing, like fundamental values that also this university holds true, the idea you'd want to ban a book about someone trying to return a book to the library and take another book out still feels very, very foreign to me. Anyway, that was just something that stood out to me in looking at all of this. And interestingly, I think for those in the audience, if you want to find out, you can see and find lists about books that are banned online, and it can be interesting to see through there, both some of those big titles of books that we might even have read in school, and then a set of really interesting, wonderful, and quirky books that might just be fun to read. And I'll maybe use this as a little plug for the Palace app by the Digital Public Library of America, who we work with. You can download this from any app store, and you can access not all. We're working hopefully to increase the percentage, but a good number of books that have been banned somewhere through this app and read them. And I think that could be an interesting journey. But anyway, going back to the question. So we talked a bit about groups that are particularly affected by book bans. We talked about librarians, but it would also be interesting, I think, to at least briefly talk about those who are making the case that books should be removed, restricted, or in some form censored. And it was interesting to learn from the ALA data that the surge in book banning attempts in 2023 was actually led by a set of specific groups and individuals who often sort of demanded removal or some form of censorship for multiple titles, sometimes dozens or hundreds at a time. And what would be really interesting for me, and hopefully for the audience also to understand, is can we and how can we potentially responsibly identify and engage with those challenges and those who support them? And is there a way to maybe engage in some constructive dialogue and maybe try and bridge those differing viewpoints? you would like to take that first?
I guess I can take a first crack at it. I think it's challenging, right? Because I think the feelings and emotions run so hot. And I think that's part of what we're facing right now. Although I have to say that I think a lot of the energy runs really hot on Facebook, right? Or on the internet. But when we're talking one-on-one with people, I think that can just de-escalate. I talked to a librarian in New Mexico who had someone come with one of these lists of books who'd been organized by one of these organized censorship groups, right? Like they're organizing people into making these challenges in their libraries. And so it was a patron he had in the library all the time, a homeschool mom who taught her kids at the library, and that was a dedicated member of the library community, but who had sort of been pulled into this fight and given a list of books to challenge. And he talked about his response, which was to say, okay, so I see this list of books that you don't want in the library. Is there anything that you do want in the library? And they were able to have, because he had a relationship with her in advance of the challenge, because he was an engaged public librarian, he was able to say, well, what do you want? And she had a list of 5 or 6 books that maybe I wouldn't want to read because I'm not interested in them and maybe have a different political viewpoint. But he added a couple, and engaging with her in good faith, even though that may not have been how she was engaging with him, allowed him to mitigate that conflict a little bit. And so I think understanding that people who come to us in the library with a big long list and they come with a bombastic argument that there's terrible stuff in the library, that's often can be diffused simply by treating people as people. I was in, I went all over the country as someone who was targeted by the right this year, and the only place I ran into any kind of actual protesters was in Florence, Kentucky. 2 people, 1 sign, quickly relocated across the parking lot from the conference hotel to continue their protest in front of a Cracker Barrel, right? And so I think we don't want to overestimate their strength and their power. And then we also, right, like that's one front of these challenge kind of things that we're facing. The one that I find more intractable are the pieces of state legislation that are being passed that, whether I negotiate with you as a human being or not, whether you and I can come to an agreement or not, if there is state legislation that's restricting my ability to put certain kinds of books in my collections, that's a bigger, larger problem. So I do feel that the winds are sort of changing a little bit. I don't know, Emily, if you do, but it depends on the day. Okay, maybe not. But in my hopeful moments, what I think we're really going to be left with is the legacy of these state laws. And that requires a kind of political organizing work that matches what extremists are organizing, right? Like we need to have library supporters be as densely organized, running for school boards, promoting libraries, doing the work as intensely as our opponents are. And that's a different political conversation. That's probably beyond the scope here, but not that I don't have lots of ideas about it.
Yeah, I don't know, Emily Knox, if you want to add anything to it. Otherwise, we can also move to the next question.
I think the only thing I'd say is that what I really focus on is that it's actually people's fears that are revealed by these challenges. Fears about a changing society. It's also related to a particular interpretation of texts, right? That if my child reads this, then this will happen. And we have to remember what Rudine Sims Bishop said is that books are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. Often the window part is forgotten, that it actually opens up for you to learn about other people. You may agree with them, you may not. It's like all sorts of things can happen when you encounter a text. And so I really think that it's almost impossible without having these one-to-one conversations with people, but thinking about what are they saying about the world when they say, I don't want this book in the library. It's actually revealing much more about them than it does about the library or anything else.
Yeah, thank you both. We sort of touched already moved into, I think, my next question in a way, with the mention of Facebook and also the debate on book bans. Do you see that both sort of the increasing prominence of social media, but also of digital, sort of wider digital content platform, has influenced and shaped the debate on intellectual freedom and book banning? And do you see particular challenges there beyond what we already just touched upon for Facebook, or also potential opportunities in this context? Maybe Emily Drabinski, we could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media has made it a lot easier to be a real jerk, in many ways. Like, people will say things online that they would never say to your face. I was giving a talk in South Carolina. I was invited there to meet with some school librarians at great personal and professional risk to those librarians, right? That the weaponization of the American Library Association and me in particular over the last year has made it very challenging for people in many parts of the country to even invite me to have a conversation. And that's, a longer story that I'll tell when I'm able to reflect on that a little bit. But they invited me to come and talk, and I was so honored by that. And at the end of my sort of talk, someone stood up and said it was so important for us to see you and for you to see us. And I think captured in that little moment was everything that we need to hold on to is still important, that we need to meet each other where we are, rather than imagining that the sort of digital Sturm und Drang is real reality. I mean, it definitely is reality, and it has a real effect on people's mental health and on people's sense of safety and people's sense of fear. But I do think that if we let that noise be the only story that we tell about what's happening in American libraries, that's where there's, I think, a real risk. And I think, that's a challenge. And then to the second part of the question, digital access to books means that the text of books is widely available in many places, right? There's the initiative here at University of Chicago. There are initiatives at multiple other libraries, Brooklyn Public Libraries, and that means that we have the means to get the word out to people in parts of the country that would not otherwise be able to read these books. But if we define the problem strictly in the terms of being able to read the book, then that's the solution. I think it can't be the solution, because this sort of book banning moment is about some larger political struggles that we're all a part of. And so remembering that noise isn't determinative, but in fact tells us that we need to be as loud as they are, I think is one thing I'd say to that. But I'm interested in your thoughts, Emily.
Yeah, I would say in terms of like organizing, what I try to remind people is that you can also organize online. And so it doesn't have to be just a place where people who are on the other side are organizing. And I think there gets like this weird discussion about authenticity. Well, is it authentic if I start my own Facebook group for, being for the library? Yes, it doesn't matter. Get people any way you can. One thing I worry about with electronic information, we should all remember what happened in Colorado when EBSCO was sued for pornography in its database. They could never find the image. But I do worry that the way that ebooks work, especially in public institutions, that they are done through consortia, that people will say, well, this is just not a good idea overall. Who is making these decisions? I don't like that my child has access to all of these books now. So this is just something I'm mindful of, that, we already had it with EBSCO. That was the wildest case ever. I encourage you to look it up. And just thinking about, yes, this provides access, but only if you have certain devices. Only if you're able to get things onto those devices. There's still a need to provide lots of information in different formats.
If I can maybe add one thing that's very much on my mind after recently having visited the public libraries in Munich in Germany, where I'm from. It's a very wealthy city, which arguably has strong public infrastructure. And even in that city, there is also a not tiny number of people who do not have internet or might not have a computer, and who in particular during the pandemic really suffered when the libraries were closed. So I agree in some ways that access to the content is not maybe the main challenge as much as we think, but there are also groups in society who really rely on, in particular, their local libraries to access things online. And if these libraries are prevented from providing access to content, there might just be no other way. Or someone else put to me, there can't be a book ban if I can buy the book on Amazon. Well, that assumes I can go online to go to Amazon and I have the funds to buy that book. And that is not the case for everyone.
Can I just say
there
that-
are huge,
Oh,
sorry, we both want to jump in. Go ahead, Emily.
I'm at Peoria Public Library because we were out in the boondocks of Illinois and there was no Wi-Fi, and I needed to be online at 9:30 today. And so I was like, I know where I can go. I can go to the public library and I will be able to get online to do that. I have all the devices in the world. It did not matter. I needed to get somewhere, and I wasn't charged to use this lovely study room today. And that is very important.
And I just think policymakers believe everyone has an email address and a credit card. In addition to all of the digital divide stuff that we talk about, like not everybody has a credit card, right? And that's something that I had to learn touring rural libraries this year, over the past year, and I wish more policymakers knew what library workers know about what the public faces.
Yeah, that I think I can wholeheartedly support, and thank you very much for the library that's currently supporting us in having this webinar. As we talked about policymakers, maybe we can briefly talk about them. So we've seen some states, and we talked about some of them like Florida, Texas, but also others, where there is there are legislative attempts, or in fact even legislation that restricts access to books or encourages censorship. We've also seen other states, Illinois, where we are based, but also Washington and Maryland, who've passed legislation trying to outlaw or restrict book bans. What impact do you see these legislative efforts have on libraries and their work in the context of banned books?
I mean, it's huge. The impact is huge. Most of the censorship folk, like the bad law, we would say, maybe, I don't know. There's probably a word for it, but most of those laws they're vague and overbroad. And so it puts librarians and library workers in a position where like they have to try to comply with a law that doesn't make any sense. I'm originally from Boise, Idaho, so I think a lot about Idaho and the recent piece of legislation there that requires you to move a book from one section to another if it is challenged by anyone, right? Anyone in the public for being as inappropriate or harmful to minors. That's not possible if you live, if you work in a one-room library. And in a rural state like Idaho, you physically can't move the book. There's nowhere else to put it. So we've seen librarians having to make decisions about not allowing children in the library without a grown-up, or having to go through a bunch of hoops to fill out a form to allow a child to enter the library. And that limit of access, I think, is really challenging and restricts how libraries can respond. And then is it harmful to minors? If you read harmful to minors language in the Idaho Code, it says that anything about homosexuality written to promote it, or to promote sexual desire or something like that, I forget, is harmful. But then the interpretation of that piece, like, does that mean if it just has lesbians in it, I can read it? Or is the presence of a lesbian so like it's too risky? And so you're having libraries having to balance risk when they're already balancing plenty of risk, right? And the penalty in Idaho for failure to move a book is $250. And I get really stuck on that $250 because it is both a comically small amount of money in the state budget of Idaho, but it could be the entire collections budget for a public library, right? So that, like, it's clearly meant to control and limit what public sector workers can do to meet the needs of their communities. And the fear and anxiety and the paralysis that produces, I think, is part of the point.
Maybe I can sort of from there on lead into the second question and then get a take on both of you from this. There's obviously an issue here where we have a tension between those who want to access information and literature and others who have concerns about something being controversial, or what I sometimes hear, maybe not controversial per se, but not age appropriate. How can we sort of help navigate that tension, and how can we have a constructive discussion within our communities with librarians and patrons on how to sort of educate them on these issues and reach a, for lack of a better term, constructive balance between these tensions? Emily Knox, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I think the main thing when I used to teach intellectual freedom is that I don't focus quite so much on this anymore, is to let people know that the library has something for everybody, right? I used to think about challenges really, if you're talking about a one-on-one, that book is not the right book for you, right? That's one way to think about it. I really think about Ranganathan's laws, that every book its reader and every reader their book, right? It's difficult to do this because of the power of books. People, if nothing else gets revealed by all these book bannings, is that people think that books are really important. And when you think about that, you have to approach this in many different ways. So the truth is that some people will never see, you know, a value in diverse or challenging books. They want books to not do that. But they don't get a say over what everybody else reads. That's really the main thing, is that we're actually talking about a power issue here. And the people who are running libraries have a collection development policy so that they can support everybody in the community with their information needs, which will be different for different people. Some people will never be on board with that, but I think if we're going to advocate, we have to talk about that more. So I've actually been talking to some librarians about, like, think about your displays. Are you putting out, for example, Amish romances for your displays, right? You might be in a place where actually people are focused on these books, but you need to actually also show that you have some of the most conservative books you've ever seen in your life that are available for you to check out. I think thinking more about all the different people who are coming to the library and what are we saying is here and available for people is one way to do this. But there are, quite frankly, some people who never get on board.
And I would just add that, like, we can't meet sort of organized book banners where they are. We meet everybody else where they are, but these people, like, they want to set the terms of the conversation and the terms of the debate. And to the extent that we participate in that by getting defensive or arguing, I think it's not productive, which is not to say that we don't resist, right? That we don't push back, that we don't organize against it. But I think for me, trying not to take on their language and, you know, to say there isn't pornography in the library. I mean, obviously there isn't, but, like, rather than, you know, talking on their terms, making sure that we control the conversation, I think, is the shift. Because I spent my whole career in libraries with people telling me libraries were obsolete and not important and that reading is over, right? And I think you're exactly right, Emily, like, books are important and they really matter, and so do libraries. Apparently they're the most dangerous places on the planet. And so this is a real opportunity for us to step into those conversations and make our arguments and share our claims, you know, not argumentatively, but be like, did you know that the library was, like, the kind of world we want? If we just had more libraries, we'd have the world that we want, you know? And, like, there's an opportunity here, I think, as well as, you know, I'm always trying to find the silver lining, and that's it. And maybe it's a little thin, but I do think there's an opportunity here.
Thank you. What you just said reminded me, and this might be of interest for those of you who find themselves at some point in London, that the library I've worked for previously absolutely had extensive pornography collections, because the British Library collected everything published in the UK, and the UK has a very active publishing industry that covers every topic that you could possibly conceive. So in some contexts, it's a benefit because there are people who are doing research in those areas, and for research libraries in particular, it's important to serve all of these needs.
Absolutely, but it's not in a school library, right?
Yes.
And that
So we talked quite a bit about where we currently are and the challenges that we're facing. And I think before we then open up the Zoom for questions from the audience, I wanted to look a little bit ahead. What do you think are the most sort of pressing challenges or opportunities linked into intellectual freedom and book banning that you can see ahead of us? And not making this maybe just about us here reflecting on these topics, but can you maybe also leave all of us in the audience with one concrete step that we could all take if we wanted to make a difference in this space?
I can take that first. I mean, I think the most pressing challenges that from where I sit are the pieces of legislation that are now in force in many states that will take a whole lot of organizing and political work to undo. The speed with which you can dismantle a public institution is shocking to me, right? You can have libraries that, have been built over 100 years, and then all it takes is like one angry sort of patron and some state legislators to just completely collapse it. So I think the challenge will be to pull some of that legislation back. I think that that's the really difficult work, and keeping people connected to the discussion when political winds sort of change and the topic of conversation changes, right? Like that we need people to continue to see that intellectual freedom challenges are an issue and that their public libraries need their support. We're going to need to keep that conversation going even as the distractions or not distractions, but the legitimate other political issues maybe take up more airtime. So I'm very concerned that in the presidential election cycle, which has a dynamic that I can't believe is American politics right now, that book banning will forget that it's an ongoing problem and that in fact we have a lot of work to do to undo what's happened over the last couple of years in this country. In terms of a concrete step everyone can take right now, I think when I think about which public institutions survive, they're the public institutions that everybody uses. So you've got like Social Security, for example. Here's a public institution that is everybody gets access to it, so everybody supports it. Nobody wants I mean, there's like a little subset, but most of us support that that institution, that we want it to continue. And I think for libraries, the more people we have using in them and engaging them, the more durable they are. It's very hard to make an argument that your local library is peddling pornography and is dangerous to children if everybody in your community takes their kid to story time and uses the library and knows the librarian. And so even though it's simple, I think making sure that you have a public library card and you use it, that everyone in your community has a public library card and uses it, I think that's actually the single most important thing we can do. And I'm sure everybody in this room has, if not like multiple, I have multiple public library cards, right? Like I'm a big user of my public library, but making sure that everybody that we know is also doing that and engaged in the institution, I think it's like an easy and quick thing that we need to do.
Yeah, I'm going to second the laws. I'm extremely concerned about these laws. I don't know if you've seen, and just to the audience, the pictures of the signs in the Idaho libraries. It is extremely upsetting. I'm also concerned about the dismantling of public institutions in general. ProPublica just published an article about the voucher system in Arizona and how it has leading basically to the bankruptcy of the state, and is just pulling money out of public schools. This is just an overall project to dismantle public institutions that we really need to be aware of. The one concrete step, along with getting your library card, is to read banned books. I actually encourage people to read mid-list banned books. These are the ones that you might not hear about as much. These are authors who might feel like they are stranded. Encourage your library to buy these books. There are lists everywhere. So we often focus on the ones that are at the tops of the list. I'm talking about the ones that are down below the top 20. Buy these books for your friends, request them at the library. Actually, those requests make a huge difference. I will give just one quick thing I just read on, I think it was the Reddit subreddit for a library. Someone said, someone was facing LGBTQIA books in, and they said, yeah, when that happens 20 times, we put it by the desk and say that this has been recommended by our community members. Things like that actually make a big difference. So those are the concrete steps that I recommend people take.
Thank you both. I really appreciate that. We said we would leave time for the audience, and I think I can already see have way more questions than we can realistically go through. So I would just suggest we jump in and see that we can answer or discuss as many of these as possible. The first question is about neutrality in libraries. More and more universities are adopting institutional neutrality policies, something that originated at the University of Chicago. What are your thoughts on this with regards to libraries?
Do you want to take that, Emily? It seems
Sure.
more up your alley.
So I spent a lot of time talking about neutrality in libraries. I think the important thing to know is that libraries are not neutral when it comes to intellectual freedom and providing access to information. That is what libraries are about. And the way that manifests itself at various libraries can be a little bit different. Libraries each have a mission, and you develop your policies based on that mission. So when I think about something like an institutional neutrality policy, that's not something I would ever recommend that a library do. What I recommend that a library do is to think carefully about their mission and their vision and the policies that they develop to support that mission and vision. And it will be very different. I worked at a theological library after graduating from library school. That was very different from what happens here at Peoria Public Library. But libraries in general support the core values of librarianship, and those get worked into the policies themselves. So I would say that it's not actually possible to be neutral when it comes to something like freedom of expression or intellectual freedom or providing access to information. That is a stance that is taken by these very important institutions. So I know this is something that universities have been doing, but the way it works in a library is a little bit different.
Thank you. Let's maybe move on to your next question. In fact, we have a set of 2 questions that come together on a similar theme. The first one is, as a children's public librarian and instructor of an MLS course on access and intellectual freedom, I've experienced firsthand the struggles of book challenges, personal attacks, and the emotional toll it takes. How can I honestly convey to my graduate students the difficulties of this work without discouraging them, while also inspiring them to understand the importance of fighting for intellectual freedom and access? And do you think these efforts could lead to a more supportive environment for future librarians? And the second related question I'll also throw out, isn't part of the problem with organizing that the banners are all fired up and for us, their challenges are exhausting and depressing? How do we stay out of the depressed zone when fighting back? Also, Torsten, you seem great, but wasn't there a third Emily available for this panel? I mean, there's a clear theme here.
The best antidote to despair is winning. I love to win. And people love to win and they love to feel themselves to have power. And that's what we see happening among these book banners. They're organizing together and they're winning. And I think the feeling that you get when you're able to change the material conditions of your life and the life of others and in your community, that feeling, that rush is really real and really intense. And when we do that in collectively as part of an organized group, that is sustaining. It's not just book banning, right? Like when I think about it, so I have a child who's growing up in the world right now, and he's going to face a world of climate change that feels disastrous sometimes, a kind of veering towards right-wing fascism, not just in this country, but all over the world. Like, what kind of world is he going to have? If there's so much out there that can fill us with despair. And the antidote to that despair is working together with others to change some small part of the story or the picture. And that's where I draw my strength. So it isn't that we always have to be working this second job as organizers against book banning, because nobody wants to do that, right? Like the Olympics are on, I got to watch surfing, right? But to the extent that we can come together to solve small problems together and to give ourselves a sense of that power, I think that's where things are sustaining. I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be a librarian than right now, because the terrain of struggle, it has come to us, and there's so many ways that we can win. And I feel like I get like a little bumper sticker about this, but when we work together with others to change material conditions, we feel our world to be like more possible for us to shape the future. And I worry that we are not giving ourselves enough opportunities to do that, right? Where the right is like an engine of those possibilities. So if you come in and say, I want that book off the shelf, and then you win and that book is off the shelf, you're emboldened to do other kinds of powerful things. And so figuring out what those wins can be, I think is really important, and not limiting those wins to just the book banners agenda. So is there something else in your library or community that you could organize around and change? Like, there's no shortage of those things, right? Like getting somebody to fix the leak in the roof, getting your administrator to be more fair about workplace issues, getting more staplers in your library. Like thinking about all the kinds of little things that we can organize around, I think is really important. And for me, the only antidote to despair is organizing with other organized people for the world that I want. And there are lots and lots of ways to key into that. And I think it's really important that we look for those.
Emily Knox, if there isn't anything that you wanted to add, then I can maybe briefly answer the last question that was on me. And yes, there could have been a third Emily, but we are running a range of events on the topic of book bans, and I felt it was important to be here as moderator, because a lot of the debate that I've seen, I think, has really centered on public libraries and school libraries. And what I sometimes hear is a sense that the big, influential, prestigious research libraries, who are not normally directly affected in the same way, are maybe not as visible and do not stand up. And I think it's important in that sense, as a dean at the University of Chicago, that I can say this university library and this university stands in solidarity with librarians, and we feel that there should be freedom to read. And I think that is an important message to send. And we'll have different people speak on different perspectives, but that's partly, I think, the message that I'm here to send and the discussion that I want to encourage. So that's maybe as a quick response from me on the last point. Let's maybe pick up another question from the audience that goes back to something that we've discussed before. So the question is, I would like to press on the question of the who is underpinning the move to ban books. In my work, looking at trigger laws, which has a direct relation to this topic, is that space, the argument is that this move to create curriculum is driven by parents. But as you look at the narrative which dominates this push, what is clear is that there are patterns which suggest that the arguments are drawn from the right-leaning political movements.
Yeah, I'd like to address this. It actually does not matter. When you are working at the library, or you are in your school and a parent or someone shows up and says, I want this book taken out, they may have had someone come from behind them, but you are dealing with that individual person right there. I think that thinking about like, but is this person dealing with some sort of like their brain has been, manipulated in some way? When you are in the school and you're working with the children and a parent comes up, all that matters is that parent talking to you, saying that they're upset about something. So yes, we can look at the larger picture about, what are the arguments they're making, who is behind it, Moms for Liberty. But in the moment, that doesn't matter as much as it may seem like it does. This is what I kind of mean by authentic. This is an argument to me that says like, well, is this person being authentic about that? As the person addressing it, you actually can't worry about that person's authenticity or all these other things. You need to make sure that you are addressing their concern, making sure that you are following your policies. Where they're coming from can matter for me as an academic, in a bigger picture for those of us who are part of freedom of expression organizations. But I really would, I don't think that that's a good tactic for the people who are working on the ground. You can then go out and say, well, how do I organize against this? But when that person is talking to you, that person is making this argument about your collection, and you have to deal with that person as a person.
And I would just add that, like, I do think like ideology shapes what we imagine as possible, right? Like we're seeing like the concern I have about the dismantling of liberal arts curriculum at schools across the country. The argument is, well, students are voting with their feet, right? They've decided they don't care about history, but individuals, what we believe about the world, that it doesn't. It comes from the ideological framework that we come up and through, right? The things that we assume are possible are shaped by institutions, social, cultural, political, that make some things possible and not others. And so that authentic fear that parents have about the books that their children may be exposed to, and it's authentic, right? I agree, Emily, that many people come to the library and they're like, I heard that you have this book and that it's going to make my kid queer, which, by the way, is a great thing to be, but it's going to make my kid queer, so we got to remove it from the library. That is a concern that has been produced by ideological forces much larger than the individual. And so it's why I think we both need to be addressing the intellectual freedom concern that comes to the desk, right? And as a profession, we have to deal with the need for challenge policies and all the kinds of work that we're doing in the intellectual freedom space. But if we don't tie what's happening in the work that we're doing to larger political movements, then we're going to end up swimming upstream, and in a in a way that doesn't, where we're not thinking about critically changing the direction of the water. And that's deeper, harder political organizing work beyond the scope of this conversation, beyond the scope of ALA, beyond the scope of the individual librarian. But we've got to pay attention to the political movement work that's necessary to support the outcomes that we talk about in the current moment.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have another question that's a bit similar to the last one. Are we confronting a society reintroducing values that deny civil rights, suppress freedom, and promote colonized knowledge? Could you integrate that the book ban entails decriminalization of librarians and educators, authors, and so on? Further, it reestablishes racism, sexism, feminism, gender, and sexuality, eradicating otherness.
I mean, it feels that way to me, that we're in a fight for the small gains that we have won over the last decades of political and social struggle, right? This is, I think, a backlash that's really, we've got to win this fight, and the fight has chosen us, right? And so that means that we are in this political moment where we have to fight for these kinds of issues. And just to address one of the other questions in the Q&A, as knowledge workers, the ways that we describe resources, the metadata we produce, the ways that we circulate materials, like all of that core work that we do to form the infrastructure of what it's possible for people to know, that is the work that we have to do, right? That when we engage in, you know, reparative metadata practices, an area of my own research, that you know, we make sure that we're describing materials so that they can be accessed, that we need to really value the core library work that we do, so that the no matter what happens, the libraries that we have and the catalogs that we produce and the books that we're able to circulate continue to tell broad stories about that include all of us, not simply the sort of victors in the political fights that we're facing right now.
I think I want to address the first part, which is the idea of reintroducing values that deny rights. I want to think about that idea of reintroducing. And in fact, public institutions have always been a controversial space within our society. When the public school movement, the public library movement started, these were places that were always pushed back against by various people. So this is, you know, looking at the history of the late 19th century, you will see that people were very upset that schooling was being taken, especially schools, was being taken out of the home. We've always had this argument in our country that the home is where people should learn. If you think about like reintroducing civil rights, you know, we've never passed the Equal Rights Amendment in this country, right? This is not something that is, I guess, I don't ever see these things as being settled. This is constantly a fight that happens over time if we look historically. So one thing I've been saying to myself quite a bit is that we shouldn't have actually been surprised that there would be this pushback in this time of retrenchment and reactionary politics against these institutions, because they are a symbol of you know, collective action. You pay your taxes to support these institutions. You know, it is something that is against what people with reactionary politics want to see the world and what they would like to see. But this has actually always been true. If you look at these movements from when they first started in the late 19th century.
And I think it strikes me from also what we've discussed before that one of the reasons why this is reflected in libraries is because books are symbols and have a certain power in themselves, even though maybe 10 years ago the narrative was that the book would go away. Clearly that symbolic power has not gone away. There was another question in the Q&A that Emily Drabinski, I think you briefly referenced, and maybe we can at least briefly tap into this in a little bit more detail. It's a slightly longer question, so please bear with me. The library's ethos of promoting a world-class culture of inclusion and diversity in terms of books is pivoted upon the library's ability to retain and respect foreign library staff, which seems to be dissonant with their current policies of misclassification and lack of willingness to cooperate on urgent matters of immigration for those workers that work most closely with the most critical materials, including banned books. Given how processing foreign materials is an important priority to not just the library, but several dozens of faculty members depend greatly on them for the research of underrepresented voices, is the university's approach to foreign workers in key positions justified? So that's a bit of a broader question. And I think, Emily, it was sort of specifically directed your way. I don't know if there's anything you can say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just, you know, I don't know the particular impetus behind the question, but I would fold it into this sense that the attempts to ban books are also attempts to restrict the authority and agency of library workers, which I know I'm repeatedly saying that, but I think it's really important to remember, and that we have to see the censorship issues as also labor issues, and we need to have a respected library workforce in order to ensure access to information for everyone. And I think it speaks also to what Emily and I were both talking about earlier, that there is the particular act of censorship happening right now, but we have to think about that in the context of hundreds of years of missing stories, right? And that we, you know, the work that we do requires us to rely on expert staff, and that sometimes those labor issues have to be addressed in the same time that we're talking about censorship. So I would just add that.
I can't address this in particular, but I would like to say that it's no mistake that feminized professions get attacked for being somehow lacking expertise. Teachers, librarians, these are highly feminized professions. And in actually quite weak institutions overall, if you think about it. And it's no mistake that they have been targeted because it's mostly people targeting women and saying, you don't have expertise. They don't make this explicit all the time, but if you think about it, you can see that in fact, people are saying teachers don't know anything, library workers don't know anything, and why are these women telling me that I should have this in the public sphere in the first place, right? So all of these issues are very much wrapped up together, and I just want to emphasize that, you have to think about the professions as a whole and how people understand them in society.
Totally, Emily. And people think we don't do anything or know anything, that it's very easy to form a library. But I think about many years ago, I heard an anecdote that's maybe not true, that the most popular tag on Flickr, the photo site, was the word me. Because people want to identify pictures of themselves, right? That there is actually like an orientation toward the public and public access that we know about that others don't. The idea that it's unimportant or non-professional or not a skill, it's just, yeah, an uphill battle, and the feminization of the field, I think, is definitely a part of that. I agree.
Well, we're almost at the end, but I think there's a relatively short question that we might have also a shorter answer to that I think is relevant because we touched on internet access a few times. Has there been any concerted efforts to filter internet access at libraries by the same groups wanting to ban books? Or maybe, even though it wasn't explicitly asked, also beyond the same groups that want to ban books?
This is actually a settled issue. So when the E-rate was first passed, I want to say in the 90s, early 2000s, if a public institution accepts the E-rate, they must filter their internet access. An adult can ask for that filtering to be removed, but that gets into all sorts of social issues about asking someone, and what are you looking at that you need to remove the filter? So when I say that the culture wars come back around, this is it. This was a law that Congress put in place because of all the bad things on the internet. It is an overly broad law. Who makes those internet filters? I actually have research on this. In some states, there is one person-ish who comes up with a filter, and it gets applied to all the libraries that accept the E-rate. They can be extremely broad. They just take away some category based on search engine optimization. So this is an issue that we will probably return to again and again, in fact, the way the court decided was against the American Library Association, who argued that internet filters are actually not in keeping with the First Amendment.
Well, thank you. I think it's time to wrap up. Before I hand over to I think Christy, who will close this, I wanted to say, Emily, thank you so much for being with us today. There was also a point made in the Q&A that's, I think, more an encouragement than a question, which I think I'll maybe read as my final contribution. It's from one of our guests who say, help support books and authors by uplifting banned book titles. Follow the Digital Public Library of America on social media channels. It highlights a banned book of the week. So I mentioned this before. There is also the Palace app that we are collaborating with the DPLA on that makes a broad range of banned books available. And then I think saying what our panelists have also said before, you will all have at least one public library somewhere near you. I think they're great resources. Use them. That I think is the best way to support them. So Emily, thank you both very much. And then I'll hand over to Christy, who will close this webinar.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone in attendance. And thank you again to Emily Knox and Emily Drabinski for being our excellent panelists, and to Torsten Reimer for moderating. I just wanted to mention again that this recording will be made available in August at some point. So we'll be working on that. Keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, thank you again. And I hope everyone enjoys their day.